My name is Kat Traxler, and I'm a security professional in the Twin Cities. And at my day job, I have the opportunity to work on a ton of really interesting cloud security things. And what's developed from that is a personal fascination, really, around cloud platform, cloud native identity concepts. And a major topic of interest of mine that's developed has been the confluence of identity and these cloud platform APIs and kind of the tangled web that can ensue from that. Today, I want to go over a quick, brief history of the GCP primitive roles and give everybody a little bit of background on where they came from. I'll then touch on the owner role, the viewer role, the editor role, who becomes an owner, an editor, and a viewer in your projects, and what some of the risks are associated with that. Finally, I'll spend a little bit of time on what we can do about the risks. Before Cloud IAM was introduced into GCP, there were only primitive roles, ACLs, and access scopes. These were the only mechanisms available to limit access to resources. Once Cloud IAM did come online in 2016, along came with it the ability for permissionings and predefined roles and custom roles. But all those other mechanisms like primitive roles, those were not deprecated. Those just became part of the menu of options available, sometimes a conflicting menu of options for controlling access to resources. First up, we have the owner role. Owner means exactly what you'd imagine it is. You own all of the resources within the context of a project. You have the ability to set IAM on a project and any of the resources housed within a project. You can set the owner role at the org level, but it won't grant any org level permissions. Any IAM bindings of owner at the org level, all that means is that the owner role is going to be inherited down to the projects. And if you don't change the defaults in your organization, the owner role and honestly projects are going to proliferate. This is because all of your users in your domain are granted the project creator role by default. If a user can create a project, then they're bestowed the primitive owner role of that project. But remember, this is, again, all within the context of a project. If you're expecting the viewer role to be something like a read-only access to configuration information on the control plane, you're going to be really disappointed. It certainly provides that, but much, much more. When you cat out the IAM permissions within the viewer role, you're going to find some really unsavory crossovers into the data plane. A viewer can read source code. Yes, a viewer can read and download the binaries from Firebase and all the code you've uploaded to your cloud functions. A viewer can read the contents of managed databases like Spanner and Cloud SQL and can even execute SQL commands off of Cloud SQL. The primitive role viewer is certainly not akin to the AWS security audit policy, but vendors seem to be treating it that way. I'm referring to those vendors that are offering cloud management asset solutions, the type of products that are often billed as single panes of glass, holistic views into your project. They're catching up with GCP and they're rolling out offerings to support your multi-cloud strategy. But in my casual trolling of publicly available documentation, I found that most vendors in this class are recommending that you accomplish read access into your project by granting a service account the viewer role. I'll emphasize casual trolling of publicly available documentation as I haven't performed comprehensive analysis of this practice, but it's certainly a thing. If you want some comprehensive, extensive research on third-party risk, just an hour ago, Keston Broughton presented a fantastic talk on insecure integration patterns within cloud vendors, I highly suggest you watch that and read his accompanying blog post. The viewer roles spread into the data plane is all a result of excessive Cloud IAM permissions contained within the viewer role. But excessive permissions are not the only way that primitive roles can burn your IAM house of cards. The primitive roles owner, editor, and viewer are often thought of just like any other predefined role, albeit really broadly permissioned. This isn't entirely accurate. Primitive roles are referenced as special groups. This shows up when default ACLs are assigned and inherited in BigQuery. When a new data set is created in BigQuery, the creator of that data set is naturally and automatically granted the owner ACL. Makes perfect sense. Also, when a new data set is created in BigQuery, the three primitive roles are by default assigned ACLs. An owner is assigned the owner ACL on the data set. All editors within the project are assigned the writer on that data set, and so on. And this practice of default ACL assignments, it may have made sense in a time when primitive roles, ACLs, and access scopes were the only mechanisms to control access. But in this world, we expect access to be controlled with IAM permissions. These inherited ACLs are just counterintuitive, and they contribute to misconfigured access. If you're like me and you like to enumerate out permissions contained within a role on a Friday night, you might use the gcloud CLI and do IAM roles describe to cat out all of the permissions contained within a role. What you'll find is that neither the owner, the editor, or the viewer role contain the permission BigQuery tables.getData. That's the permission that allows viewing of data within BigQuery. So if you're looking strictly at IAM permissions contained within primitive roles, you're going to have no indication that these roles will grant access to BigQuery data. The last primitive role I'll cover, and the one that I think is most interesting from attacker's perspective, is the editor role. You can think of the editor role as more or less containing all of the permissions that owner does, minus the set IAM permissions. And editor is really ubiquitous in projects by default. And this is all thanks to the default service accounts. When an API is enabled that relies on a default service account, Google will behind the scenes create a new customer managed default service account and assign it the editor role. A ton of GCP services use the compute or the app engine default service account as their default identity at runtime. These services are compute, app engine, cloud functions, data flow, dataproc, GKE nodes. Not a comprehensive list, but the list goes on. I'd argue that the default service account is a pretty core convenience feature to the platform. Say that you're a developer and you want to create a cloud function. What's the least surprising thing to happen? Well, if you have the role allowing for you to create a cloud function, and you have the service account user role, you can create a function. When that function executes, it works. How this is all achieved right out of the box is through some unsavory default behavior. Cloud functions will use the App Engine default service account as the default identity at runtime if a unique service account is not specified at the time of creation. This service account has been assigned by default the very broad editor role into your project. This just ensures that just about anything you want your function to execute, it will have the appropriate permissions. The primitive roles, owner, editor, and viewer, are concentric sets of permissions. And contained within the editor role and owner, but we'll focus on editor here, it has some key permissions as it relates to operating service accounts. That is, an editor can create service accounts, an editor can create service account keys, and an editor can act as a service account. There's org policy, which can be applied to disable service account creation and disable service account key creation. So we're going to focus on the act as permission as it relates to this attack chain. The act as permission, it is not transitive in nature. It is unlike the get access token, and it is unlike the get ID token permission. Those two permissions allow for a user to obtain an access token for a service account via the public GCP APIs. However, I would argue that the end result, the impact of the act as permission, has the same effect. Act as is just like AWS pass role, where the permission is required to create most services. It's required for the binding of the resource to the runtime identity, whether that's a default service account or a uniquely created custom service account. Whatever IaaS or PaaS service you want to create within a project, an editor pretty much has free reign. And I'll emphasize within the context of a project. That is, if you have the ability to create storage buckets within a project, you can only create those buckets within the project. And that implies that the blast radius is contained within the security boundaries of the project. That is not true as it relates to the permissions allowing for the operation of service accounts. If those permissions are abused, the impact can spread beyond that of your project. Here I've crafted a fictitious scenario where a user account has been compromised, which has the ability to create compute instances. This compromised account would have the role allowing for the creation of compute and would also have the service account user role. It's important to know that the compromised account does not need to be a user account. It can also be a service account. That'll work just fine. The attacker-controlled identity would spin up a new compute instance, allow the default compute service account to be naturally used as the identity for the compute VM, use SSH or OS login to remote into that instance. From that internal position, you can access the metadata API server that can be easily queried to obtain the access token for the service account. In this case, the service account is the default compute service account. Now armed with the access token for a service account containing the editor role, this attack can be rinsed and repeated. Perhaps there is another service account in the same project with org level permissions, or perhaps there's a service account which has an IAM role into a different project. Whatever the next steps are in this attack chain, the point is there are next steps available for the attacker. The only prerequisite enabling this attack chain to kick off besides initial compromise is that an API would have had to be enabled at some point during this project's lifespan. This would have precipitated the creation of that default service account and the granting of the primitive editor role. Not required to kick off this attack. You do not need to have the ability to create a service account. You do not need to have the ability to set IAM policy on a service account. We're just using the default service account that's likely already in place in any given project. Utilizing the default editor role assigned to the default service account for privilege escalation is, at its core, a escalation up the hierarchy. It's also abusing the ease to which you can create resources to use them as conduits for grabbing more privileged tokens. In the scenario I described, the attacker-controlled account initially had access to a single service account, by virtue of the service account user role and the act as permission. The attacker used that permission to obtain project level permissions to operate all of the service accounts within the project, with the end result being that when you have the act as permission at the project level, combined with some ability to create some resource, such as compute, you can retrieve the access tokens for all of the service accounts housed within a project. What started as a single mapping between a user and a service account, what I would just call like a one-hop privilege escalation, just becomes this difficult to quantify spider web of lateral movements and escalations. Org policy can help you out here, but you might find the trade-offs to be somewhat unpalatable. There is an org policy in GCP which will strip out the default editor role from the default compute and App Engine service accounts. Naturally, you might even be tempted to delete the default compute and default App Engine service accounts from all projects. But if you completely nuke the default service accounts, this is going to put your users in a bit of a bind. You'll naturally be forced to provide some mechanism for service accounts to be created, some mechanisms for service accounts to be used as identities for resources. You might find yourself in a position where you're granting users the ability to create service accounts and set IAM policy on service accounts, and then use those service accounts during resource creation, which, if you're doing that math with me, is going to measurably decrease the security posture of your project. A more effective use of org policy in this situation is to, yes, remove the default editor role, but replace it with something less privileged. This approach can also be problematic, as the default compute service account and the default App Engine service accounts are, in effect, shared credentials. They exist as identities for a number of resources and services. You can attempt to enact least privilege approach on these service accounts, but they're likely to just become tumbleweeds of permissions. Regarding the owner and viewer role, and this goes for editor too, broadly speaking, there should be no reason you should be assigning these roles to your projects, either to users or to customer managed service accounts. Regarding the owner role, if you don't want a user to be able to set IAM policy in your project, if you don't want a user to be able to read all BigQuery data, if you don't want a user to own all your buckets within the context of a project, I would say there's no reason to assign the owner role. And the viewer role never makes sense, whether or not you're going to be assigning it internally to a member of your domain, or certainly not to a vendor. If you want to provide that read-only access to the control plane, you might be tempted to assign the security viewer role. And I wish I could recommend this role as a good substitute for viewer as a control plane only read, but there are just a ton of gaps in this role's access to configuration information, and it's going to be a struggle to get that to work, honestly. I would be remiss if I didn't call out some giants in the GCP security field. Chris Moberly, I highly recommend you check out his 2 blogs, Tutorial on Privilege Escalation and Privilege Escalation in OS Login. Both of those are published in GitLab's blog posts, I believe. Spencer Geetson, I know he is famous for creating Paku and for just an iconic list of blog posts regarding IAM privilege escalation. He had the same impact with GCP, enumerating out dangerous permissions within GCP. I had a talk about 6 weeks ago on privilege escalation via service accounts, which I consider this talk to be a little bit of an extension of. And then just one of the most underrated talks that I've seen, Dylan Aray and Allison Donovan had a talk about GCP metadata API. This is from B-Side San Francisco this year. I want everybody to have it sink in with them that all of this research in GCP security came out since February. Prior to February, I would have no bullet points here. There was literally nothing published in the world of privilege escalation in GCP. So if you are currently working in the realm of AWS security and you're thinking, boy, there's too many problems that are already solved in this space. I want something just maybe a little bit more messy. Please, we could really use you in GCP. We could use more research. We could use more logs. We could use more tools specifically. I've only ever talked about the risk associated with customer managed service accounts. Now, customer managed service accounts are those that are resources within your project and you control. Google managed service accounts, on the other hand, are resources within Google's projects, and they have IAM bindings within your project. Very little research has been done around the security risks within regards to Google managed service accounts. What research there has been done has not been promising. Has been demonstrated on a couple different occasions that we do have access to those service accounts by way of the metadata API. So if anybody is looking for some opportunities for GCP research, I would highly recommend to do more exploration in the risks around the Google managed service accounts and their IAM bindings within our projects. And with that, I am available for questions, and please submit feedback.
Thanks, Kat. I think the first question, and this may be, well, I guess the first question is, has GCP shown any intention to deprecate these roles in new projects or organizations, especially now that this research has started to come out and pile up?
No.
Fair enough. Fair enough. We'll keep an eye on it to see how.
Yeah. No, I think there's parts in the documentation where they do say like don't use these roles. I've caught snippets in documentation here and there, but yeah, they're not. I don't think that they're going anywhere.
And then another question from the Slack is, if the default viewer role is over permissioned, has the ability to read data and code that you wouldn't want, what's your recommended path to create a role that has the metadata or the view permissions other than the resource viewing, not the actual underlying data?
Yeah, so here we're basically looking for an analog to the AWS managed policy security audit, I think is what we're looking for. And GCP says they have it in the role security reviewer. But as I mentioned, it's going to have a ton of gaps. I'm going to kick that back to Google and say, this is something your customers need. Your customers need to be able to read control plane configuration information and not the data plane. So without that, people are left just having 403s and just fixing permissions as they go. It's a bad situation.
Certainly sounds familiar from my AWS development. Well, cool. Thank you so much. We are going to take a 30-minute break now. So those of us running the stream can get a bit of coffee and set us up for the evening session. This is a great lead into it. The evening session is on multi-cloud and governance considerations. We'll be starting at 4:30 Eastern with Matthew Fuller in his talk on rethinking the shared security responsibility model. So I'll see you in 35 minutes. Thanks a lot, Kat.
Thank you.